Welcome to Hominin History Hub. Tonight we begin a journey to the farthest edges of human memory, to a time before maps, before cities, before history as we know it. Imagine the forests, the rivers, the vast mountain passes that stretch beyond sight, where footprints of the earliest travelers may have been washed away long before anyone thought to mark them. The wind whispers secrets of a world untouched by modern understanding, a world that carries stories too old to fit comfortably in our minds. Every shadow here hides a question. Every river bend conceals a path walked by hands that left no art, no written trace, only the faintest echo of their presence in the earth itself. In the silence of the night you can almost hear it, the soft crackle of frozen soil under cautious steps, the rhythm of distant streams that guided them across the land. These first travelers crossed continents without a name, without monuments, navigating the raw and unpredictable wilderness. How did they survive? How did they know the rhythm of seasons, the migration of animals, the hidden dangers of predators larger and faster than themselves? Each decision was a matter of life or death, and yet we have barely begun to imagine their courage, their ingenuity, or the unseen strategies that allowed them to reach lands thought unreachable. And then there is the mystery. Evidence emerges here and there, fragments of tools, faint traces in caves, isolated relics that hint at a network of people moving across landscapes long abandoned by memory. Some evidence challenges everything we thought we knew about when humans first set foot in the Americas, because these discoveries are older, stranger, and more complex than we ever anticipated. They hint at a presence that seems to have vanished almost deliberately, leaving behind only whispers for us to chase. As the night deepens, consider this: what if the earliest Americans were not who we imagined them to be? What if the story we have been told in classrooms and textbooks is incomplete? What if there are entire chapters of human migration that exist only in fragments scattered in caves, rivers, and the soil beneath our feet? Somewhere within those silent traces lies a truth that could redefine everything we believe about the first footsteps on this continent. Deep in a remote cave, archaeologists uncovered a layer of sediment unlike anything found elsewhere, containing stone tools and charcoal remnants that suggest a very early human presence. Radiocarbon dating is inconclusive, yet the arrangement hints at intelligence planning and survival strategies advanced for the time. This raises questions that disturb traditional timelines. Could these people have arrived centuries, maybe millennia, before the so-called first Americans? And more unsettling, what if some of them left no trace at all, merging instead with populations we only recognize much later, hidden inside our own genetic fabric? The further we dig, the more we realize that conventional history has blind spots. Fragments of bones, isolated tools, and scattered artifacts are pieces of a story that refuses to stay buried. It is here in these quiet, forgotten corners of the continent that the first chapters of the Americas may truly be found. And yet we struggle to reconcile this evidence with the neat timelines we are taught. Every layer of soil, every buried hearth, every chipped stone becomes a whisper of the people who came before, calling out across millennia, demanding that we look closer. Some of the most provocative evidence comes from regions once thought uninhabitable: glacial valleys, river deltas, high plateaus. These were not easy lands to traverse, yet signs suggest a deliberate movement across them, carefully timed with the rhythms of nature. They were explorers in a world that had no maps, relying on intuition, memory, and an acute understanding of the land. Their survival strategies were not recorded in written language or monuments, but in the careful selection of migration routes, the timing of hunting seasons, and the subtle shaping of the environment to sustain life. And here, in the middle of this story, a question arises that every viewer must consider: what if these first Americans were not a single group, not a linear line, but a convergence of peoples, each carrying unique adaptations, each leaving fragments in unexpected places? Some of their descendants unknowingly may still walk among us today. The implications are staggering. It changes not just what we know about the past, but how we understand ourselves, our biology, and our place in the story of humanity. The shadows of history stretch long, and the evidence, though sparse, is undeniable. The Americas were reached by humans far earlier than traditionally thought, and those humans were clever, resourceful, and persistent. The true story is hidden beneath layers of soil ice and centuries of assumption. And now, as we trace their footsteps, as we follow the fragments they left behind, we are forced to confront the possibility that the first Americans were far more complex and enigmatic than any history book has admitted. And now, as we trace their footsteps, as we follow the fragments they left behind, we are forced to confront the possibility that the first Americans were far more complex and enigmatic than any history book has admitted. Evidence appears in small scattered patterns across the continent, stone tools abandoned beside dried riverbeds, hearths faintly etched into sediment, and subtle marks in caves where light barely reaches. Each trace tells a story of movement, of decisions made in moments of extreme vulnerability. And yet the farther archaeologists dig, the more contradictions arise. Some artifacts appear in layers older than conventional timelines, allow hinting at populations present long before we imagined possible. It is as if entire civilizations have been quietly erased from memory, leaving only whispers for those who dare to look. The challenge lies in connecting these whispers. Unlike modern excavations with clear stratigraphy, much of the evidence is fragmentary, often displaced by shifting rivers, landslides, or glacial melt. Yet even in their disarray, patterns emerge. Across distant valleys, similar tool types appear remarkably consistent in design, suggesting shared knowledge or even communication across hundreds of miles of untamed wilderness. These early travelers were not merely surviving, they were shaping a subtle infrastructure of human ingenuity, invisible to the eye, yet written indelibly into the land. And then there is the question of identity. Who were these people? DNA recovered from later populations hints at lineages that diverge from anything recorded in textbooks. Their genetic echoes persist hidden in those who followed centuries later, suggesting encounters and integration that complicate the narrative of a singular first American. The land itself becomes a silent witness to hybrid histories, migrations layered atop migrations, each leaving a delicate fingerprint in soil and bone. The more we investigate, the more it becomes apparent that human presence in the Americas is not linear, but a complex tapestry of convergence, survival, and adaptation. Some regions defy logic entirely. Mountain passes that seem impossible for early humans to traverse show subtle signs of habitation. Coastal areas thought inaccessible during glacial periods reveal faint tool caches and hearth remains, indicating that these early peoples adapted ingeniously to extreme environments. The evidence challenges our understanding of human resilience and raises profound questions. How did they navigate without maps? How did they coordinate hunting, foraging, and shelter in lands that were vast, dangerous, and unknown? Each discovery forces us to reconsider the limits of early human capability and the sophistication of their strategies. And yet, with every answer comes another question. Did these early Americans interact with other populations migrating across the globe? Were they isolated or part of a broader network of human species exchanging knowledge, tools, and genes? The genetic trail, faint but undeniable, suggests encounters, integrations, and disappearances, moments where one lineage merged into another, leaving behind only the faintest trace of identity. It is a story not written in monuments or inscriptions, but encoded in life itself, in the biological and cultural inheritance of those who followed. Across the landscape, from frozen valleys to dense forests, from coastal cliffs to arid plateaus, the earliest Americans moved with a quiet purpose, guided by instincts honed over generations. Their journey was one of survival, yes, but also one of ingenuity, adaptation, and foresight. They left behind artifacts that now serve as whispers across time, urging modern explorers to question what they thought they knew about the beginnings of human habitation in the Americas. And in those whispers lies the profound lesson: history is never as simple as it seems, and the first footsteps on this continent are only the beginning of a story far richer and more complex than we have dared to imagine. And in those whispers lies the profound lesson: history is never as simple as it seems, and the first footsteps on this continent are only the beginning of a story far richer and more complex than we have dared to imagine. Across plains and valleys, evidence of early human ingenuity continues to surface in unexpected ways. Small clusters of stone tools lie hidden in sediment layers that shift with the seasons and the passage of centuries. Each tool tells a tale of problem-solving, of adaptation to harsh climates, and of communities learning to survive in a world that offered no guidance. The earliest Americans were not passive wanderers. They were deliberate, thoughtful navigators, shaping paths across uncharted lands, guided by instincts and knowledge passed through generations. In some remote caves, charcoal remnants reveal fires tended with care, their smoke patterns recorded on stone ceilings, as if in silent acknowledgement of the lives lived below. Animal bones arranged near hearths suggest careful planning of hunting and preservation techniques. Even the faintest impressions in soft soil hint at social interactions, shared tasks, collective movement, and strategies for survival that required more than mere instinct. These traces suggest that early humans understood cooperation and foresight at a level that challenges our assumptions about primitive life. And yet, mysteries persist. How did these populations interact across vast distances? Genetic studies hint at connections, unexpected encounters, and occasional integrations between groups that were separated by hundreds of miles of wilderness. These connections, though fragmented, may have shaped not only survival, but the genetic legacy of the Americas. Some lineages vanish entirely, while others merge, leaving subtle fingerprints in descendants centuries later. The story is woven not in written language, but in the fabric of life itself, in patterns detectable only by careful study of remains, tools, and the environment itself. Along rivers that carve deep canyons into the land, archaeologists find remnants of dwellings crafted with remarkable ingenuity for the climate and terrain. Stones stacked to retain heat shelters, oriented to the sun, and rudimentary storage spaces hint at planning and environmental understanding rarely attributed to humans of this period. Even temporary encampments indicate awareness of seasonal cycles and resource availability, evidence of survival strategies that required both observation and learning. Each discovery challenges the linear narrative of human colonization of the Americas, suggesting instead a complex, layered migration history that we are only beginning to unravel. Consider the coastal regions where rising seas may have erased much of the evidence. Underwater surveys and sediment cores occasionally reveal stone tools and shellfish remains that confirm early human habitation long before established timelines. These findings suggest that early Americans may have been adept at exploiting marine resources, using knowledge of tides, fish migrations, and seasonal abundance to supplement land-based hunting. Their survival depended on flexibility, intelligence, and intimate knowledge of a world that was simultaneously dangerous and generous. And now a question emerges that strikes at the heart of our understanding. What if some of these early populations left no trace at all in the archaeological record? What if they blended seamlessly with later arrivals, their presence detectable only in subtle genetic markers or faint cultural echoes? Every artifact we uncover, every sediment layer we analyze challenges us to reconsider. The notion of a single first American history may not be a straight line, but a complex mosaic of peoples, migrations, and interactions, many of which remain hidden in plain sight. Through forests, across frozen valleys, and along ancient coastlines, the first Americans moved with purpose and intelligence. Their legacy is not only in the artifacts they left behind, but in the questions they force us to ask today. How much of what we know is shaped by gaps, by assumptions, by layers of earth and time that obscure the truth? And how many stories remain untold, waiting for patient observers to uncover the faint whispers of human ingenuity, courage, and survival etched into the very soil of the continent?
And so the journey continues without tidy maps or neat chapter breaks, moving into a world where memory hides in sediments and survival was written into the fabric of landscape itself. The people who first crossed these stretches understood flow. They read rivers like living charts and recognized the moods of mountains. Their movement was deliberate, not random. Each step encoded a choice rooted in deep observation. Where we see emptiness, they saw corridors. Where we see danger, they saw pattern. Their intelligence was practical, calibrated by seasons and honed by the unforgiving math of scarcity. They did not think in centuries, they thought in cycles. In rugged passes where wind bites sharp and exposure could kill a small party in an hour, they learned to time travel differently. They compressed knowledge into gesture, into rhythm, into shared silence that passed like instruction between hunter and child. They passed memory as behavior rather than as maps. The landscape was their library and their kin, and they treated it with the reverence of someone who reads a living book. There are traces of this everywhere if you learn where to look. Hearths under overhangs placed to catch sunlight in winter caches of shell and bone, hidden by tidal seams, stones with repeated flake patterns that reveal a shared logic across distant camps. This was a species of deep listeners. They listened to the flow of meltwater, to the shifting of migrating herds, to the whisper of winds that foretold weather by day. Without compasses or compacts, they navigated by pattern recognition and cultural memory. Their calendars were biological. Their forecasts came from observation calibrated across lifetimes. That heritage survives not as tidy manuscripts, but as decision rules embedded in ways of life passed down in small acts of habit, where to lay a fire, how to store a fish, which valley yields most in drought. And yet the archaeological silence is paradoxical. So much of their technology was ephemeral, made from plant fiber or bone, that decayed, leaving behind only the durable echoes of stone and bone that survive to our instruments. The absence of grand structures does not imply absence of complexity. Instead, it forces us to expand our definition of material culture to include transient systems, networks of seasonal routes, and shared knowledge that conspired invisibly to sustain human life under extreme conditions. When we speak of patterns, we must also speak of networks. These early people were nodes in loosely connected webs that spanned river basins and coastal arcs. Ideas and tool designs hopped from camp to camp like contagious rhythms. Transmission happened through encounter and imitation, by watching an action and repeating it by mimicking a flake pattern until it was absorbed as local craft. This social learning is what allowed subtle technological packages to diffuse across vast distances, becoming standard in places no one would expect, and creating an invisible cohesion that archaeology only slowly recognizes. Modern researchers now apply high-resolution methods to tease out signals buried in soils. Micromorphology residue analysis and microstratigraphy reveal use of space at scales previously invisible. In flakes and hearth lenses, we find patterns of reuse and maintenance that suggest planned return and logistic foresight. There is evidence that some camps functioned as seasonal hubs with specialized tasks, while other locations served as temporary nodes in long-distance provisioning systems. This logistical sophistication undermines the caricature of the primitive wanderer and replaces it with an image of strategic planners who orchestrated movement across continents. And the genetics layer complicates the picture further. DNA extracted from ancient bones and from modern populations sketches a patchwork of relatedness that crosses what we once drew as neat boundaries. Admixture events show that populations met interbred and carried genetic innovations across landscapes. The biological record corroborates the archaeological signal. People moved mixed and shared survival knowledge. Their bodies carried the memory of those movements forward. These genetic echoes explain why some cultural elements reappear in distant regions separated by ecological barriers that would seem insurmountable to a naive observer. This does not mean everything is legible. Much remains opaque, encoded in behaviors and ecologies that do not fossilize cleanly. But the convergence of lines of evidence, tools, hearths, DNA, and landscape reading creates a more convincing mosaic than any single dataset could provide. The work of reconstruction now is less about finding singular monuments and more about assembling distributed evidence into coherent sequences that respect the rhythm of place and time. As we follow this path, we begin to see the first Americans not as a single expedition, but as a demographic process characterized by pulses of movement, pauses of settlement, and episodes of integration. These pulses responded to climate, to food availability, to social opportunity, and to the messy contingencies of chance. Each pulse left sedimentary traces, and each pause allowed cultural repertoires to refine and stabilize. Over millennia, these processes produced the diverse populations that would later populate continents, not by a single event, but by a protracted sequence of adaptations and exchanges. Across these landscapes, the lesson becomes clear. The peopling of the Americas was a process of adaptation layered over deep time,
a choreography of movement and settlement that required memory mechanisms beyond single lifetimes. And if we accept the evidence honestly, we must also accept a humbling conclusion that our neat origin stories are inadequate to describe a living past that taught survival as a practice and knowledge as a shared distributed achievement, one that belongs to many hands and many minds, and refuses to be reduced to one tidy origin. Myth. He knew the past had weight, not metaphorically, but as a physical mass that pressed against deep time like a geological force. Africa was not an abstract concept in the prehistoric imagination. Africa was the furnace of becoming. Africa was where chemistry learned persistence. Africa was where selection pressure wrote code into bone. Africa was where thunder and drought and heat and hunger braided behavioral intelligence into the nervous system until cognition was not optional, it was required. The world was not generous, it was adversarial, and the only shield that worked in that environment was the shield of problem-solving. So the early hominins did not simply survive, they debugged existence in real time. They optimized movement in relation to terrain. They optimized memory in relation to pattern. They optimized cooperation in relation to risk. Every generation that failed to compute the environment correctly went extinct, and the ones that did compute the environment correctly left ghost signatures in the archaeological data that now acts like a long-range transmitter aimed straight at us. They left stone flakes, butchered animal bone, heating treated rock, pigment, engraved pattern, spatial distribution clusters that prove planning, that prove intention, that prove predictive mental simulation running in biological hardware millions of years before silicon was even imagined. And when the cognitive architecture crossed the invisible threshold where improvisation became repeatable method, method became reproducible protocol, and reproducible protocol became cultural memory, humanity stopped being an accident and became a process. Nothing was sudden, nothing was miraculous. Everything was iteration, everything was compounding effect, everything was incremental recursive escalation that fed back into itself until complexity crossed the boundary where the system could no longer be reduced to single variable explanation. And in that emergent strange loop, the modern species blueprint was seeded as probabilistic future. That seed was Africa. That future was already inbound before anyone would ever call themselves human. They experimented with environment. They experimented with edge case survival. They experimented with material properties, with fracture mechanics, with thermodynamics before they had language for any of it. They invented trial and error inside open-air laboratory that had no instructor, no diagram, no archive, just consequence feedback loop. That loop trained predictive modeling. That loop trained abstraction. That loop trained the ability to mentally simulate a future condition before it executed it. That is the origin of engineering. That is the origin of computation. That is the origin of optimization culture that still defines the way our species navigates threat landscape. This was not a brief anomaly. This was multi-million-year process that did not slow down, even when climate volatility spiked to catastrophic level. Every time the planet punished the early hominins with destabilizing variation, they used variation as engine of innovation. That pivot orientation toward variability became the master key, and because the master key was variability, the system never locked into one brittle configuration that could be easily destroyed. Instead, the system became anti-fragile. It gained by taking damage. It learned by being attacked. It improved by being stressed. That is why Africa was not simply the birthplace of a species, but the birthplace of a pattern of mind that would eventually scale beyond the boundaries of a single continent. Human intelligence did not emerge in spite of adversity. It emerged because adversity was the training protocol of deep time. They carved meaning into the rhythm of survival long before writing ever existed. And as the timeline advanced into the band between 2.6 million and 2 million years ago, the Earth itself began to show the signature of minds that were no longer simply reacting to the world, but beginning to shape it. This is where the shift from accidental survival toward intentional strategy became clearer in the soil record. Because something changed inside their cognition, the future began to matter. Hominins started taking actions that paid off later and not immediately. They cached things, they pre-positioned resources, they tracked the return intervals of herd migrations, they learned the seasonal pattern of rivers and the rhythm of heat and drought in ways that pointed to longer range planning and not just moment-to-moment instinct. They were building a memory not just in their brains but in their tools and in the landscape itself. This was the beginning of ecological engineering. Hunting was still opportunistic, but now it was also predictive. A stone edge wasn't just a tool. It was an extension of time, stored potential, a future advantage waiting to be activated when the moment arrived. Fire wasn't fully mastered yet, but the spark of controlled landscape manipulation was forming in the neural language of possibility. This is where working memory began to truly flex, where branching futures began to occupy mental space, where multiple timelines could be held inside a single mind, and this is where social distribution of skill became a survival amplifier. Individuals didn't need to know everything. Knowledge could be partitioned, shared, stored across people, stored across generations, stored in the routines of the tribe, stored in the location of a specific riverbed 12 kilometers away that only one member specialized in extracting the perfect chert core from. This is the real moment where mind became network, and Africa became the laboratory where emergent cognition scaled itself through cooperation, not isolation, where selection didn't only reward strength or speed, but rewarded the capacity to compress experience into memory, and then deploy that memory strategically later. You can see the evidence in the density of flakes. You can see it in the controlled removal patterns. These were not random breaks. These were intentional geometric solutions. The brain was evolving around pattern detection and recursive iterative refinement, the very foundations of future mathematics and future technology, long before formal logic ever existed. And as these early humans began to master the art of preparing for future contingencies, the continent itself became a living archive of trial and error, where each generation benefited from the experiments of the generation before. This is how the axis of human complexity began to tilt upward, not suddenly, not explosively, but through the patient accumulation of optimized behavior, slowly forging the neural infrastructure that would eventually make symbolic thought possible, not all at once, but in micro increments, each one stacking onto the last, across eons of relentless adaptation shaped by heat, drought, predators, scarcity, and shifting climate patterns. This was the era where survival itself began to become strategy, not reaction. And this is how the seeds of niche construction, the seeds of engineered environments, first took root in the African earth. As this strategic mind matured, something else emerged, something even more radical, the slow rise of identity through shared experience. Because survival in this era wasn't just the body learning the world, it was the world slowly learning them back. They weren't simply adapting to landscapes, they were modifying landscapes so future versions of themselves could survive more efficiently. This recursive loop, environment shaping hominin, hominin shaping environment, began to define the next phase of African cognition. And this feedback loop is what eventually created cultural momentum. Rituals didn't appear suddenly, symbolic language didn't appear instantly, story didn't erupt in a single generation. These things emerged as the inevitable side effect of cooperation scaled over geological time. The rhythm of action became the rhythm of expectation. Expectation became pattern. Pattern became meaning. Meaning became the first primitive architecture of shared internal worlds. And this is why the simplest flake scatter can represent more than a tool tradition. It represents the beginning of a mind that could store more than physical technique. It could store abstraction. The past, even in this early state, was no longer just the past. It was becoming usable memory. It could be referenced, compared, refined, transmitted. This is not just evolution of anatomy,
This is evolution of continuity, a lineage learning how to carry forward intellectual scaffolding, not genetically, but through socially inherited structure, through the invisible frameworks that allowed knowledge to survive even when individual bodies perished, through the slow conversion of lived events into shared mental architecture. This is where the pressure of climate, danger, and scarcity didn't just sculpt muscle and bone, but sculpted the early architecture of collective intelligence. The continent itself became a generational external hard drive, a continent storing the fragments of a mind still learning how to think across time, still learning how to compress reality into transferable form, still learning how to turn survival into a system. And this is where the first spark of future culture quietly took shape, not in temples, not in cities, but in the patient, relentless, iterative engineering of survival written into the ancient African earth. And through this slow but unstoppable layering, what we eventually begin seeing across African deep time is not chaos, but direction, a direction that does not point toward one species, or one branch, or one destiny. It points toward a network, because these early hominins were not linear. They were not one straight ladder climbing upward toward a final, perfected human blueprint. They were a branching, interacting, exchanging web, a mosaic evolution unfolding simultaneously on multiple fronts, multiple intelligences emerging at different speeds, multiple solutions being tested in parallel across different ecological stress zones, multiple forms of cognition evolving from shared ancestral memory, yet diverging into unique adaptive signatures. And inside this web, Africa becomes the primary processor of hominin possibility. Here is where variation became strength instead of confusion, where diversity of bodies created diversity of thought, where difference itself became an engine, not a disadvantage, but a generative force. And each lineage left something behind, not just fossils, not just fractures in stone, but instructions written in failure and success, embedded into the behavioral architecture future species would inherit without even understanding why certain instincts worked. This is the hidden archive, not in museums, not in libraries, but in the invisible inheritance of behavior. This is where the story becomes bigger than genealogy and bigger than taxonomy, because what took shape here was not just biological evolution, but the precursor to cultural evolution. The continent was not just making bodies more capable, it was making minds more transferable, a system capable of transmitting not just reaction, but strategy, a system capable of storing not just memory, but interpretation. This, here, is where the deep African past begins turning into the blueprint of what we would eventually call human civilization.